Hey guys, what's going on? I know I said that I was probably going to be done with videos for the year, but I actually have a bunch of videos that are in my backlog that I wanted to share. And they're a bunch of different stuff, probably than what you're used to seeing from me. So earlier this year, I had the honor of speaking at the Silhouette online conference, and it was, Silhouette Studios. It's like you see them everywhere. There's lots of imitators like Cricut. I'm not a big fan of them. Silhouette Studio is definitely where it's at. So if you are someone who enjoys the Silhouette and wants to get a better understanding of how some of this stuff works from a creative's perspective or from a photographer's perspective, then you're going to enjoy these videos that I'm about to share with you. But if you're not, if you're used to like my camera reviews and other stuff like that, then please feel free to pass on this. But this is going to bring value to someone in the creative industry who wants to create with the Silhouette Studio. Just thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait to share this video with you. Thanks so much, guys. Take care. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining my class today. I am super pumped to be back for another workshop here with you guys, and today I'm going to go over a bunch of different things inside the image effects folder in the Silhouette Design Studio. I have the best version that you can get. Although I am not a cutter, I am a photographer by trade and a filmmaker. It is like one of those things that I'm so grateful and thankful that Terry has had me back for another season, another workshop, so I can kind of go over just some basics with Silhouette Studio and how it comes to work with photography and with the things that you cut. So what we are going to do today, like I said before, is we're going to go over each section on the image effects section of the Silhouette Design Studio. So you're going to be able to see exactly how some of these things work and why they are. And I'm also going to give you a little history behind each section. So hopefully that will give you a overall better understanding of what you're doing and why you are doing it. So I always kind of feel like having the history helps with a better understanding of doing what we do as creators. And that's what we are here, right? We are all creators within this conference. So we're going to create some great stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right to it. One of the things we're going to do first, excuse me, sorry, I had to clear my throat there. I'm going to take a photograph that I took and I'm going to just dump it in here. Now, obviously you can see that this is a gigantic frame, a gigantic photo. So on a Mac, I need to like lower my workspace. So on a Mac, you're going to hit Command minus. And what that is going to do is that's going to shrink that workspace so we can see that entire image, so that way we can make some adjustments. If you are on a PC, I believe that's Windows minus. And if you wanted to expand it, it would be on an Apple, Command plus, and on a PC, Windows, I think, if you're one of those weird people that have PCs. But I work from a Mac, so I know this like the back of my hand. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to move this down so that way we can see the entire photograph that we're going to be working with inside the Silhouette Studio design software. Now, I will tell you this image that you're seeing is actually from an upcoming photo project that I'm working on called The 50, which is a survey of interracial relationships in the United States. And it is based off of the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court case, which made the ability to marry whoever you wanted law of the land. So I've been working on this project for the last 4 years. And if you're interested, you can find that information somewhere in this conversation, somewhere, I'm sure it will be linked somewhere. I'm getting ready to launch this first book. This is a book that I have worked on. It's my first photo book ever. And I have worked on it for the last 4+ years. And I'm finally ready to turn it into a book to share the stories of these wonderful couples with the world. But I'm digressing here, but I kind of wanted to share a little bit about that first. Okay, well, the first thing that we are going to do is we obviously need to get this photo to work into the workspace that we're cutting or that we're designing with inside the Silhouette Studio design software. So I just clicked on the photo once, and then we are going to shrink this image down, and then we are going to reposition it to make it work with inside our cutting space. I'm going to shrink it down just a little bit more here, so that way I can make sure that I get this wonderful couple here, so that way I can show you exactly what we are working with here. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. So this would be one of those things if I was like making a sticker. I don't know, maybe you are making invitations or something for someone and you wanted to use like for a wedding announcement, or maybe it's for an engagement party or something along those lines. This is one of the things that you could do with inside the Silhouette Design Studio. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm now gonna make sure that my frame is pictured exactly where I want it, and I'm going to hit Command plus because I want this to be nice and big for you guys, so that way you can see exactly what I'm doing. So as you can see, if you come to this little half circle here where my mouse, let me make it big here. There you go. You see that? That is the image effects software that we are currently using. And I'm going to give you guys a little description about all of these things that you see, so that way you have a better understanding of what you're doing. So in the first section of this is what you call gray shade. I'm not quite sure why it's called gray shade. Every program that you use will call this feature something different, which I wish there was like just a universal name that everyone would call it. So that way, if you are using Photoshop or Lightroom or Giphy, or you're using some other type of software, you would know exactly like what this feature does. But essentially, what this gray shade does is it converts your color images or whatever you're creating into black and white. And the reason why you may want to turn it into black and white is because you may realize that it works better as a black and white image than it does a color image. And sometimes we're going to get into this a little bit later. When you're dealing with RGB and CYMK color profiles, the one thing that is pretty consistent is how they render black and white. You're not going to see that much of a difference between those two color spaces. But what you're doing here is in the gray shade, which is the first section that we're in here, this pretty much turns your image black and white. So you can kind of see as we kind of bring that fader up, it's kind of just fading the image and turning it into a nice contrasty black and white image, which, to be fair, it actually looks pretty good. Most black and white conversions can be really all over the place. Sometimes they can be a bit more gray, because that is actually how our cameras sees things. Our cameras are trying to get to medium gray. So sometimes in developing programs, again, like Photoshop or Lightroom, you don't really get the contrast. But when I was first playing around with this, I was thoroughly surprised at how great this image converted from color to black and white. But that pretty much essentially is what the gray shade does. It just converts your color image to black and white. So we're going to go ahead and turn that back to color. But that is one of the first things that you can do, probably the easiest things to do. And how do you say, again, we're going to go back to the RGB, CMYK, and you may realize that what you see on your screen is going to be different than what you see actually printed or created. But again, we're going to talk about that here a little bit. But the easiest way to nullify all of that color difference is just converting it to black and white. And you may realize the image may actually work out really well in black and white. All right, I'm just rambling, but let's go ahead and jump to the next one. So that's pretty much what grade shade does. Colorize. Now, this is one of those things that it, you know, how do I want to say this fairly? Colorize is a kind of snazzy term, but in essence, the only thing that you're capable of doing in this section is changing the hue of your image. And again, we're going to go back to talking about what hue actually is. Hue in color theory, that's pretty much what we're talking about with any sort of design that you do on your computer or photograph that you print or project that you're printing. It's all going to be measured in color theory. And in color theory, a hue refers to the pure pigment, that is without tint or shade, added white or black pigment. Gosh, I'm getting tongue-tied here. Hues are one of the first things that we process in our brains. It's one of the things that we see. It's how we see the different shades of blue and the different shades of green and the different shades of red. Now, when you're working on the Silhouette Studio, it uses RGB as a color space. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. One of the great things about hue and about the way that we look at things is that hue is just a part of the color theory. So we don't want to make it something more than what it is. And I think a lot of times we can get color and hue confused, but they're kind of go synonymously with each other. Hue refers to the origin of the color we see. And what I mean by that is, like, we can see red, but our eyes can differentiate between the types of red. Our eyes can differentiate between the types of blue and blacks and grays and purples and greens and yellows and my favorite color, orange. So what I'm referring to here when I talk about hues, like a hue of red can generally be separated into a couple of different colors. Like it can be hue of red is like burgundy, pink, magenta, wine, or crimson. Color of blue can be indigo, teal, turquoise, navy, or sapphire. I know sapphire to me is always like it is a stone, but it is also a color. And it's the same thing with hues of green. And when we look at hues of green, we look at lime, mint, emerald, jade, and olive. Those all kind of different types of colors of green is kind of what you can do here in the colorize. And one of the reasons why you want to know a little bit more about hues is because we're talking about working in two different color spaces. We print from CMYK, but our eyes see RGB because we're working on a monitor. Now we're going to go back to talking about that a little bit more, but I kind of want to show you just what this hue does. So on the hue thing, as you can see, the first color that we're jumping into is green, and it is changing the colors to green, and then we go into blue, which you're kind of seeing that lavender, and it kind of changes everything to blue and lavender. And then as we go into our reds, and you can see how the color spaces are just changing. So when you're working in the Silhouette Studio and you realize that a color has printed a slightly different color in the CMYK color scheme, you can come into your colorize section of the Silhouette Studio and make some minor adjustments to those color schemes. Now, on the opposite side of this, you can see we're at 100, and the image is exactly where it was when we started, but it's on the opposite ends of the color hue. You're going to have your original image, and on the polar opposite side, you're going to have your original image, and then everything in between. As you can kind of see, it affects it differently into the RGB color space. Now, I just kind of ranted and raved about that, but that is pretty much what that section does for us. Now, the very next section is probably the one that will affect your image the most. And this is contrast, brightness, and saturation. Now, brightness is generally thought to be one of the simplest concepts, right? We can make the image brighter or we can make it darker by a specified amount. But first, we must distinguish between true brightness and something else that is called gamma. Now, we're going to talk about gamma in a little bit, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of that. Increasing gamma is by moving a mid-tone slider. Now, I know we'll talk about this when I show you guys what it looks like in like Lightroom or Photoshop, but is moving a mid-tone slider on the histogram, and it's not quite the same as increasing brightness, because when you increase your gamma or your midtones, you're only increasing the midtones of the image or the midtones of what you're printing. Increasing gamma midtones can make an image look brighter, but it is not linear. It only increases the brightness of the shadows and the midtones in an image, and it doesn't affect the highlights. Traditional brightness, kind of like what we have going on here, on the other hand, it simply brightens the entire image from the shadows to the highlights, and it does it evenly. So what we're going to do here is, as we raise the slider all the way up, as you can see, that image, it starts to fall apart as you add more brightness. And if you go the opposite way, as we subtract brightness, you can see that it goes completely black. So it does it evenly all the way across the image. So we're going to go ahead and put that back up to 0. That's pretty much brightness in a nutshell when we're dealing with the Silhouette Studio. Now, I cannot reiterate this more, but this is, how do I say, like, Silhouette is fine for making really small micro adjustments, but if you really have images that you're going to want to make some more significant adjustments to, you're probably going to have to use an application like Photoshop or Capture One or Lightroom. Capture One is a little bit cheaper as a one-time purchase, but it is a little bit of a bigger learning curve to learn than Lightroom or Photoshop. And Lightroom and Photoshop is just really the industry standard. Now, I want to talk about the next part in this one, and that is contrast. Contrast is defined as a separation between the darkest and the brightest areas of the image. When you increase the contrast, you increase the separation between the dark and the bright spots of your images, making shadows darker and highlights brighter. Decreasing contrast, and you can bring the shadows up and the highlights down to make them closer to one another. Adding contrast usually adds a pop of color, and sometimes when you add that pop of color, your image or whatever you're doing can look a little bit unrealistic to what the eye actually sees. And it makes the image look a little bit more vibrant, but it also, when you decrease the contrast, it can make an image look a little bit more dull. Now, as we kind of go through this and we kind of move the contrast slider, and this kind of goes back to like, okay, it still looks okay here, but as you kind of raise it, you can see how dark everything gets, because what we're doing is we're raising the shadows and we're lowering the highlights. And then you can kind of see that's like, I mean, some people may think that that is a great looking image, but I personally don't. But what we're doing here is we're actually like adding so much contrast that the actual image begins to fall apart. But on the other end, as we take away contrast, you can see, like going back to what I was talking about getting to medium gray, your image begins to look a little grayer because you're subtracting contrast from the image. And eventually, when you take all the contrast out, you get exactly to medium gray. And this is what our cameras are attempting to shoot at. So we're going to bring that contrast back up. Now, saturation is really similar to contrast. However, instead of increasing the separation between shadows and highlights, we increase the separation between colors. An example showing increased saturation would show the same effect as kind of like contrast, but kind of not like contrast. As a result, when you increase the saturation results in an image, you actually increase the contrast, the brightness, and the sharpness of an image. So again, what you could end up doing is you could end up having an image, if you've added too much saturation, to where it looks like something from, I don't know, like Willy Wonka's factory, or I think that was the name of the movie, like, yeah, Willy Wonka, where everybody looks like a Oompa Loompa. Or if you take away the saturation, people begin to look like someone, I don't know, from like The Walking Dead or something like that. The skin can look a little mealy. And when you take away certain saturation, your greens look sickly. Like it almost looks as if like you're eating, I don't know, like an unappeasing course of peas. But I want to show you kind of just exactly what this does here. So as we begin to increase the contrast, not the contrast, the saturation. Now that still looks pretty good, and we're at a plus 42. But as we begin, you can start to see around, let me make my mouse here big, your reds and your RGB begin to look unappealing. It looks as if his ears are sunburned, while her skin tone still looks great. His skin tone starts to fall apart. And you can also begin to see some of the red within the grass, because this photograph was shot at sunset. So if you max that out, now it is still a usable image, and the blues pop and the blacks pop, and his ear is a little red, and you start to see some of the red pigmentation in his skin tone. But if you were to go the opposite end, what ends up happening is you turn your image black and white. Now there's still some color there. It's not quite the same as our grayscale, like when we were able to our very first one, where we can turn the gray shade, where we can truly turn the image black and white. There is still in this some blue. But let's go back here and just bring that back up there. And there, I just think that image looks so much more appeasing to the eye. So I think when you are working within your brightness, contrast, and your saturation, when you're dealing with an image on the Silhouette Studio, that you just add just enough to where you think the image looks great. It's kind of like what you don't want to do. It's like kind of like a steak, right? You have a steak, and sometimes a steak is well cooked, it's seasoned well, and you don't need any extra stuff with it. Like you can just eat the steak as it is if it's seasoned well. But sometimes what ends up happening when people start getting into the brightness and the contrast and the saturation aspect of this is it begins to be like putting ketchup on a steak. Who likes ketchup on steak? Wait, I hope I didn't offend anyone. If you do like ketchup on a steak, I want to apologize, but it's the best analogy that I can come up with. Sometimes when you splatter ketchup all over your steak, it then begins to take the taste of ketchup and becomes less steak. Our goal is to keep our imagery and the stuff that we create into the Silhouette Studio looking as true to life as humanly possible. All right, so our next step that we're going to go into is gamma. Now, gamma, you remember we were talking about gamma a little bit? Increasing gamma is like increasing the midtones of an image. Now, gamma can help bring up the midtones, and it can also help take away stuff in the midtones. So, as you see, as we lower our gamma, it's actually making our midtones darker. But if you look here, you can still see, make my mouse bigger here, you can still see the highlights still look pretty good right here on his forehead and right here on her forehead. So your whites are still there, but your blacks are getting darker because you're crushing your midtones and your gamma. So eventually, as you can kind of see, when we turn that all the way down, our highlights are still slightly there. He's still there in his highlights, but we've crushed everything else and turned everything black in our midtone. So it would be the exact same. Let me go back to 0 here. It would be the exact same thing if we were to increase it. Now we're adding a lot of brightness into our midtone. Now the image isn't gone completely. We've added a lot more light, fake light to the image. And what it looks like is if everyone is kind of washed out and looks like Casper, the friendly ghost. But we're going to bring that back down to 47. There we go. Almost there. Perfect. So now we're back at our original image. Now, inversion. Oh gosh, this is like something that I think a lot of people should stay away from. It does have its useful tools. So inversion, pretty much what inversion is going to do is it's going to make your image look a lot like it would film negative. So what we do with film negative is a image is printed onto a negative, and then we convert that negative into a positive. What inversion does is inversion takes your image and creates your positive into a negative. I'm not sure why anyone would use this feature when dealing with photography, but maybe you like the look of film negatives, and maybe this is, or maybe you want to look like the gentleman in this frame. Maybe you want him to look really, really old. Like Benjamin Button, and this would be something that you would be looking for. But I don't really see a use for the inversion section when you're dealing with photography, but it's there and you can use it if you choose to or if you'd like to. But that is a option there for you. But we're going to bring that back to where we were. All right, sepia. Sepia. I always feel like if you've ever clicked on a sepia button, like on your iPhone app, or, you can find any app that can turn an image into sepia, or whatever your favorite photo app is, regardless if it's on your computer or if it's online. But I bet you're probably trying to figure out, maybe you had images that were sepia and you're trying to figure out what sepia actually is. It's really fascinating how many photographers don't know exactly what sepia is. So this is one of those things that I wanted to kind of give you a little brief history on what sepia is. But to put simply, sepia is a form of photographic print toning. It's generally a tone added to a black and white photograph in the darkroom, and they use this tone to warm up the tones in a photograph. Though it's not something that I would typically do today, but there are ways and tools that you may need it for. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So if you add the sepia tone to warm up a black and white image or a color image, essentially all that you're doing is adding to it, but the image is always considered to be what the original image is. So if we added sepia to this image would still be color. And if we had a black and white image or converted this color image into black and white in the Silhouette studio, it would still be considered to be a black and white image. Now, sepia began in the late 1880s, particularly to make photographs look better, but also because the chemicals involved in sepia aided in slowing down the aging of a photograph. It's kind of like a way that we would add like salt to meats to preserve it, to make it last longer. And that is essentially what they did in the 1880s, was they added this tone to make the black and white images really not fade as photographs used to do back then. There used to be a time where it was all black and white film, and when you would shoot a black and white film, if it was stored in a well-lit area, that photograph would eventually begin to fade. And I know you've probably have kind of rummaged through like some old photographs and black and white photographs. I know my mother and father-in-law have all these amazing photographs from like the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, from when photographs that their parents had, and they've all have slightly faded a little bit. So what they would do would be they would add sepia to help make that photograph last a little longer. So in short, sepia is more than just a color tone. It is used to extend the life of a photograph. But to put simply, sepia is a form of photographic print toning. It's a tone generally added to black and white photographs in the darkroom. And what they would do with the sepia toners, or they would work to convert them into like this traditional metallic silver in the print that would then compound and would add like that kind of, as we would kind of call it, like old timey feel. So if you've ever gone to like a Renaissance fair or a blacksmith at like, I don't know, like Williamsburg, Virginia, if you've ever gone to like one of those like old town and you could go in with your family and get a photograph taken, generally they would always make it sepia to make it feel old. That is essentially what sepia is. So sepia is just going to add some warmth to this image. So if we were to go here and we were to just bring up the strength a little bit, as you can see, the image would just get slightly warmer. And if we were to get really carried away with it, the image turns orange almost. It sounds and looks weird, but this is kind of how you would get that old timey feel. Like, I always think of like the photographs where there is a like dad with a shotgun and the mom's like carrying a basket or something, like they're going out and the kids are all looking at the camera and no one is smiling. Strange little tidbit here. So with photography, in case you didn't know this, hey, it's my class. I can share what I would like. So the part of the reason why families used to never smile when their photograph would be taken, for starters, it was really two things. One, photographs were really expensive for a lot of families, and it was a really expensive process. And the reason why they didn't want people smiling, because they were afraid that they were going to blink. That was the first reason. The second reason was when photography first kind of came out and about, that some people thought that a photograph would actually steal a piece of your soul. So you never wanted to smile while you was having your photograph taken. Anyway, neither here nor there, but that's kind of what sepia does to your images. All right, now, I need to go back and convert that back to where we were. All right, now we're back to our wonderful image here. The next thing we're going to talk about is red, green, blue. We are currently working in the RGB workspace, and I bet you're probably curious what RGB means. RGB is a color process that TVs, our monitors, our iPhones, and all this other stuff that we use, that we look at, they mix it all together on a screen, and it makes a full spectrum of colors. Now I wanted to talk about CMYK, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. That is what we use to print. Now, the very first experiments of RGB started way back in 1861 with photography. And that's part of the reasons why I'm here sharing with you today. When they layered these 3 different plates of colors, they realized that they could get a color image. But it wasn't until 1938 that modern RGB technology for televisions was developed. And that is the RGB that we use every day. Now, I bet you're wondering, why should you care about the red, green, and blue slider on the Silhouette Studio? You should care for a couple of different reasons. One, what you see on your screen is not always what's going to be printed on the Silhouette, because your computer at home is using the CMYK color space. So in order to make some small adjustments to get it back to what we're doing, we need to go back and change some things in our RGB. So let's just hypothetically say, when I print this, my blues aren't coming out the way that I'm seeing it. Well, then what I can do is I can come into the RGB slider, and I can kind of make some adjustments in my blues. Now that's kind of overkill. That's adding a lot of blues. And what we want to do here is we can just add it to make sure that it is printed the way that we want it to be printed. So I want to take a second and let's talk about the RGB color model. And we'll leave for a separate video in this conversation for the CMYK model at a later time. The RGB color model is an additive color model. The RGB color model is exactly as you think it would be, and that is a red, green, and blue that is overlaid. And when you overlay those colors, you at the point of the pinnacle where all three colors overlay, you get the color white. The reason why RGB model is important is because we use it every day. When you pick up your smartphone, or while you're watching this video, or when you're watching TV, everything is in the RGB color space. We now have a new standard, and we call that sRGB. If you're on a Mac, a lot of our computers are now using the sRGB color space. But Silhouette, for the sake of conversation, uses RGB. Now, RGB has a much wider color range than CMYK. When you are creating a piece of artwork on the Silhouette, you need to be conscious of where it will be seen. If you're creating something for, let's say, your website, and you're taking a screenshot and you want to share that on, like, I don't know, your website, or maybe your online store, then you're going to want to make sure that is being designed in the RGB workspace. But if you're using it for print, you're going to want to make sure that you are not sure, but you want to keep in mind that you are going to be in the CMYK color space. So if you're creating samples for print, you need to make sure that you think about what it will look like in the CMYK color space. I know it's a bit confusing, but we will talk about the difference in another video in this series. But since we're talking about it right now, when you print this, if I was to print this, let's say I was making stickers or something, or I was making an invitation or something in the Silhouette studio, and I realized that my things weren't, let's say I needed more red, or it wasn't accurate in the red, or his skin tone needed a little warming up, what I would then do is I would come up here into the red color space, and I would just add just a hair. Again, you don't want to add ketchup onto the steak. What we want to do is we want to add just a little salt and pepper. Not too much. And you can kind of come here and you can really narrow it in. So we've added like a +3. So if we printed this, we can make sure that our skin tones look great. Nothing is more important in photography than accurate skin tones. Or let's say, for instance, our greens are like super dull. And that's kind of what you will get in a CMYK color space. Your colors will be a little more dull than it will be in RGB. So we can raise up our greens. So notice, like, the more you add of one color, you are actually in essence taking away from another color. They're all additive. They all go together. When you add something, you're taking something else away. Just kind of think about that in the grand scheme of things when you're kind of working on editing within side of Silhouette Studio. But that's essentially what red, green, and blue does. And we are working in two different color spaces. On our computer, RGB. On our iPads, RGB. On our phones, RGB. On our televisions, RGB. However, when we print magazines, books, newspapers, children's books, that is all done in CMYK, and that is generally done in a software program like Adobe InDesign or Adobe Photoshop, so that way you can actually work into a different color space. Now we will talk about that again, like I said, in a different video, but I kind of wanted to give you some history behind some of these things that you're changing within the Silhouette Studio image effects space. And I also wanted to give you an idea of what these things do and a little history behind them. But that's going to be it for this video, and I will see you guys back in the next one, where we will talk about some other applications that you can use to take your designing in Silhouette Studio to the next level. That's it, guys. See you in the next one. Peace.